Okay, session 3. And the scripture I read first will be Psalm 41:9. Actually, this is a prophecy concerning the fact that Jesus would be betrayed to someone. Here we go. Even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted his heel against me. And actually, Jesus would quote this during the Lord's Supper period, referring to Judas. And again, God knew what would happen. Jesus followed through and knew the scripture and knew Judas would be the one, and actually quoted this scripture, even though I'm sure his disciples didn't quite pick up on it. The next scripture is Isaiah 53, verse 3. He was despised and rejected by man, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hid their faces, he was despised and we esteemed him not. Also, verse 3, I'm going to read verse 7. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet opened not his mouth, like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep before its shearers is silent, he opened not his mouth. Jesus was not only going to be afflicted with much pain and suffering when he went to the cross, as those last verses said, he went quietly. He went like a man who knew he was in the will of God, and went that way without protest and screaming or hollering or yelling like we would to say, I'm innocent, don't take me, maybe cursing like some people would, but he went knowing that was his mission. And even on the lighter side of not physical punishment, he was rejected in some way, even during his ministry. And looking back, certainly there were people that followed him for a while, but when he talked about things that would make them be more involved in what they needed to do, they backed off. It was all right if you fed me and did miracles for me, but when you're talking about suffering or you're talking about how I need to live my life, forget that. And they backed off and left him. Even one point early, his brothers, I think, and mother, one point thought that as he was out of his mind. There was a situation where they wanted to call him in a house full of people, and they wanted to get him out of there, and for some reason they made that statement that I think it's in Mark 3 verse 21 that they thought he was out of his mind. His disciples, let's face it, they deserted him in the garden, and Peter would deny him 3 times. So he lived a life in which people sometimes just left his side, more or less. And that grieved him. It probably broke his heart. But yet he went on knowing what he had to do. Okay, our lesson actually will be in John, really a couple of chapters, starting basically with the Last Supper. And when the disciples showed up for that, Jesus did something that would show the greatest example of what a servant would do. Of course, the greatest example he gave was, of course, dying for us in service to God and that. But he wanted to show his disciples that you have to be able to be a humble servant. In all probability, some of the disciples were thinking about their position in the kingdom to come. I'll be close to Jesus at his right hand, or at least his left hand, or I'll be another place down. They looked toward position and honor in his kingdom. And so I think he knew his time was short. He wanted to teach them a lesson of servitude. So here he was about to wash their feet. Now, back in those days, of course, you might be invited to a meal by somebody to go to their house. You would probably bathe. But when you got there, because you were walking in the dust of Palestine, your feet would be dirty. And if that person hosting the meal had a servant, or more than one, he would pick the lowest servant in ranking and have him wash your feet. And he would do that for them, even though it's a very lowly job. Of course, Jesus didn't have a servant, but when the disciples came in, one of them could have looked around, any one of them said, oh, you know, our feet are dirty. I need to do that for the rest of the group. But none of them would think that way because, again, they were thinking of a position in the future. And if they did that, that may demonstrate that I'm inferior to the rest of you here. And so no one wanted to admit that. So Jesus himself got on his knees, took the towel, and washed their feet. Now, of course, Peter, who would say anything quickly that came to his mind, protested when Jesus came to him. He realized that here the master, our leader, we can't have him wash our feet. And he said, don't do that, Jesus. And Jesus said, if you don't let me, you'll have no part of me. And of course, Peter went on and said, well, not only wash my feet, just give me a bath. Wash all of me. And Jesus said, well, if your body is clean, you don't need it. You just need your feet washed. And someone said this could be an interpretation. It doesn't matter if it is or not, but it's a thought. What Jesus might be saying, and particularly because right after this he said there's one among you who is not clean, referring to Judas. So someone said, when we're saved, okay, we're cleansed by the blood of God. Okay. And so we still sin on occasion. And of course, we need to ask forgiveness when we stumble and fall to restore our fellowship and let God move us on to service after we're forgiven. So in that sense, salvation is being washed. Okay, like he said, the body part's washed. We never have to wash that again. It's clean. But when we sin and trip up as Christians, we wash our feet. We ask for forgiveness of sin, so we'll be cleansed and back into the fellowship of God. And so I thought that was interesting, and it could mean that, or maybe it had no meaning of that. I don't know. Okay, so let me see if I can get my wording straight here. So next we go to after the Lord's Supper, we go to the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus is praying. He asked his disciples to pray. We had that in the last Sunday's adult lesson. But then the temple guards come, and they arrest him. And Peter was told already that he would deny Christ 3 times. I know he didn't believe it. He said that he would die for him. But as we know, he was dragged before at least 3 encounters, if not 3 complete trials, at least 3 times he was questioned and quizzed before them. And finally, of course, he would come before Pilate. And even though I think that we sometimes might jump at criticizing Peter, we might say, well, man, if I was there, I would have died for him, or I would have not denied him later on. Now, he did try, by raising his sword, he cut off the ear of one of the attendants there, and Jesus put it back on. So at that point, maybe he was brave, but later he did deny Jesus 3 times. And I don't know, some people, it's been said, who may boast that they would die for Jesus, somehow fail to live for him. And that's what we're supposed to do today. He doesn't ask us to die, some will, because of their service to God, but it's important to him that we live for him each and every day. And so that's what we're concerned about. So they bring him before Pilate. Our lesson today will sort of end there with the trial, and I think the next lesson talks more about the crucifixion. But the point is today that Pilate had a choice. Do I let Jesus go because I think he's not guilty, or do I turn him over? And when I read this, I began to think that, I think God being in control of all things and planning everything meticulously, like choosing Joseph as the father, Mary as the mother of Jesus, I think that he chose Pilate. That seems odd, to be the governor at this time. The reason I think that is that I think any other governor or in place of him, who had had a better relationship with the people, who would not be in trouble with his boss in Rome, Caesar, would have probably said, I see no wrong in him, and would free him without any threat of reprisal, of being reported to Rome or anything like that. See, Pilate, as soon as he came to be the governor, and he was governor for about 10 years, but he did a series of things that upset the Jewish people. And word got back on more than one occasion to Rome. They went around him and reported to Rome, and he was sort of chastised by the Caesar in lessons, in a way, trying to teach him a lesson that you need to be a diplomat when you're ruling people and not be so harsh. You're supposed to keep the peace, but you're not supposed to disrupt everybody so that you're causing havoc. And so he knew in some aspects that he had a series of complaints against him. And so when the leadership, the scribes and Pharisees said, if word gets back to Rome that you're going to let this guy, at least is what they implied, who claims to be the king of the Jews, that's like letting an insurrectionist go. And that was the hint they were throwing out. And so Pilate probably thought, that word gets back, then maybe that's going to be the last straw for me. So he turned Jesus over to them, even though he knew that he was not guilty of the charges. Okay, what are the questions we could have from the lesson today that we might ask in our class, or that we might think about? Are we willing to serve others as Jesus did, to follow his example, to serve others in a humble way, maybe even in a lowly position? Maybe we're called to help somebody where we have to really get down and dirty and doing it, hands on our knees to scrub and help them clean up after a disaster or something. Something else, I don't know, go into a neighborhood that we're afraid to go into, but God's leading us to do that. And if we follow his lead, he'll take care of us. There might be things that right now I can't even think of off the top of my head that we kind of consider beneath us. I don't know if I want to go in and talk to a homeless person in a shelter. I don't feel comfortable. Certainly, I've said this before to my class, jail ministry, that's the last thing I would ever want to do or choose to do. But Jesus someday may say, John, I want you to go into this prison ministry and talk to a drug addict, to someone who steals, maybe someone who's murdered someone. Will I do it? Will I lower myself and say, okay, I'll go talk to that person in society who I don't care about because they've committed certain crimes, some heinous, and they belong in jail. They belong to where they are. I don't want to go see them people. Well, will I go because Jesus wants me to? That's a question we have to do in several opportunities to minister. And the next question is, knowing that Jesus died for us, how can we live for him more faithfully? Our job now is to live for him. How can I be more faithful to that? How can I be more aware of opportunities to minister to others, or to witness to others, or to help others in a way that will meet their needs, physical needs as well as spiritual? Okay, well, thank you for once again listening. As I promised each lesson, I'm trying to keep it to 15 minutes because I know that you have a whole day here ahead of you that you want to get on with everything. So thank you again. And lesson 4 coming right up.